Alright, so in this video about mastery cycle, we're going to talk about what our mastery cycle is and how it can help further student instruction. Throughout the cycle, if you watch the video about instructional cycle, you know that students start with the pre-assessment, they go to instruction, practice, and then showing mastery. After they've done that for a couple standards, or even just one standard, however you want to set it up, they can move on to the mastery cycle. And in this mastery cycle, they're applying the standard in a different way. We don't want to rush kids along from standard to standard. Okay, you got it, move on to the next one. You got it, move on to the next one. We want to make sure they really understand what they have learned in different depths of knowledge. So the mastery cycle creates an avenue for students to take to show their understanding. And the purpose of the mastery cycle is to allow students to apply skills they have just mastered in applications that push them to think outside of the box. We want to encourage them to use the 4 C's of education: communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. And they should be student-led and driven. It should be something that the students are really interested in and can dive into. I'm going to take a second to show you some examples of the mastery cycles. This one I got from U-Cubed, which is Joe Bowler's website out of Stanford. And it's called Broken Eggs, where an old woman goes to the market and a horse steps on her basket and crushes her eggs. The rider offers to pay for the damages and asks her how many eggs she had bought, and she does not remember the exact number, but when she had taken them out 2 at a time, there was 1 egg left. The same happened when she picked them out 3, 4, 5, and 6 at a time. But when she took them out 7 at a time, they came out even. What is the smallest number of eggs she could have had? So this is kind of low floor, high ceiling, where students can get started, and it, depending on how well they understand the standard of, maybe this could be for multiples or just number sense. I had students use a hundreds chart to help them as they went, and that seemed to help a lot of students. It was very interesting to see how they decided to do it and what their different strategies were. So that was one mastery cycle challenge I had. This one, I created a Google Doc that had a mission for them for Secret Agent Divide after they finished the multiplication and division standard. And they had to teach their classmates about division and what it is, and then they just had some guidelines for that. And then the last one that we did at the end of the year, once they had gone through all the 3rd grade standards, I didn't really want to just jump them to 4th grade standards, so they took probably about 2 or 3 weeks working on this mastery cycle. They had to come up with a business, and then come up with a budget for their business, and answer the questions throughout the Google Doc. And then they also had to have a picture. And this is what some of theirs looked like. This girl made like a nursery or a daycare center. And they had to figure out like what fraction of each part each part of their business took up out of their whole business, and then the area and perimeter of each room for the building design. The student made a unicorn farm, a pigicorn farm, a sports complex. The student kind of figured out that if he could make same-size triangles, it'd be really easy to find the perimeter and area and fraction of each piece. But those are just some of the things that they did to show their mastery of all those different standards in 3rd grade. So how are they going to make the money? How are they going to pay rent and utilities? And then each part of their business, the fraction of the business it covered, the area of the space, and the perimeter of the space. And so they had to fill all this out, and we went over it once they were done, and they shared with their peers. Another thing I've done is have them make a game for a standard that they just completed, and they had to test it out with some different peers who are working on that standard at the time. So there's lots of different ways to do mastery cycle. You can be as creative as you want. So when does the mastery cycle happen? First, the student chooses their standards, they do the pre-assessment, they go through the instruction and practice, and then they show mastery. And maybe I liked to have my kids do 2 standards before a mastery cycle, kind of for my sanity of not having to make mastery cycles for each standard, and also to allow them to keep moving, because I know that really motivated them a lot. You could choose to do it after every standard. You could choose to do it after every 3 standards. Maybe once they finish a domain, you do a mastery cycle. Whatever would work best for you and your students. So usually they would pause from the instructional cycle to do the mastery cycle. And then once they finish the mastery cycle, jump into their next standard again. So the mastery cycle can be a task, a Google Hyperdoc, a project, a game. It should be open-ended and is better if it's collaborative. All the mastery cycles should have a low threshold, high ceiling, so that the lower students are able to do them, even though they may need more support, and the high students who have more abilities in that standard are able to push themselves further and challenge them. If you looked at the broken egg one, it went from 5th grade to 12th grade. Obviously, those students don't have the same concepts and understandings, but they're all able to do that challenge in some shape or form. For my high 3rd graders who did that mastery cycle, they ended up just counting on the number on the hundreds chart to figure it out, whereas a high schooler would probably try to use an equation of some kind. So we want to make sure that we're pushing students to think critically about what they've learned and apply their learning. Mastery cycle has benefits for everyone. For the high students, it encourages them to push themselves and create challenging work where they may not have typically been challenged through just working through the standard. And then the intervention for your lower students can allow students to work on a skill through another type of application. So it may be more relevant to them or more interesting, and is a good time to reinforce teaching points or ideas as they're working through this. The big goal of your mastery cycle is to have students apply and cement new learning in a collaborative, creative way that will help create connections in different areas of the brain to encourage a deeper understanding. So instead of just pushing students through the standards, we think it's really important to stop and dive deeper into the standards every once in a while. We don't want to have 2nd graders working on 6th grade standards when they don't really know how to apply the 2nd grade standards or the standards between, however it works. Obviously, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's really important to make sure students are understanding what they're doing before moving on. And the mastery cycle is the perfect way to do that.